Good morning. I'm fine. Are you okay? Cool. I need this. It's called a crutch. Because you scare me. I used to remember the big one we used to have here? It was huge. And I used to be able to duck when you threw things. I used to be able to hide. Can you turn me down just a little bit, Dane? I'm a little too loud for me. No? Okay. All right, here we go. Jonah's problem was he didn't care. He didn't have compassion. As we heard Carrie's testimony about how the crisis has helped move people to be compassionate for the hurts and the pains and the sicknesses of others. As we saw that, Jonah wasn't at all moved by the hurts and the sicknesses and the pain of others. Jonah refused to be moved by that. He was a very uncompassionate man. And God needed to teach him what was the most important thing, what mattered most. And so he went to a long series of exercises with Jonah. You know, remember the story. You've been here long enough to know that Jonah was called to go to Nineveh. Jonah wouldn't go to Nineveh because Jonah hated the Ninevites. He didn't like them at all. They were the last people he wanted to see God forgive. He wanted God to judge them. He wanted God to reach down out of heaven with lightning bolts and stamp on them like this and squish them and look up so he could say, ha, 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 ha. That's what he wanted. And although at the end of chapter 3, you see them from the king down take off all of their clothes, remove themselves from their plenty and their riches, and to stop eating for 3 days and to fast and to lay on the ash heap and to beg for forgiveness, you see that this great emotional explosion of their, God, please forgive us for what we've done. Jonah stands back and watches them and says, don't listen to him, God. That's what Jonah wanted. He had no compassion. Now, you have to understand that the story of Jonah was given to the children of Israel so that they would understand that they were Jonah. The nation was Jonah. It was a parable which was told to get their attention so that they would understand that they had been given the mission to care about the world, and they didn't care about the world. They had locked themselves up into the boundaries of the promised land. They were enjoying the comfort and the blessings and the pleasures that God had given them, but they had no compassion on the lost and the hurting around them. And it was because they failed in their mission that God brought all the problems and the struggles in their life. And I tell you, at the time of Jonah's writing, Israel was in the belly of the well. You see, under Ashurbanipal, the king of Nineveh, the king of Assyria, who resided in Nineveh, they had already begun the invasion of Israel. They had already taken some of Israel captive. They have already murdered many of the people. They had already slayed some. And many of the commentators suggest that Jonah lost loved ones. And therefore, Jonah, you see, he didn't want to forgive these people that hurt him. He wanted them judged. And God was trying to move his values around. And he brings them this very powerful lesson. You see, Jonah was confused of what the message was. So Jonah, instead of being sensitive to God and caring about other people, he runs from God in chapter 1. And whenever you run from God, which way do you go? Down to Joppa, down to the port, down to the ship, down to the sea, down into the belly of that ship. It's interesting that the Hebrew word for belly is the one they used for where he was in the hold of the ship. He was in the belly of the ship. And he had become, it's almost like the belly of the well in here, isn't it? No. He had become drugged. Disobedience is the biggest drug in the world for your awareness of God. When you're living a life in disobedience to God, you are not conscious of God's working his sovereignty in your life in every step. It is the biggest downer in the world. And when we're living in life in disobedience, we're walking away from God, and we ask the question, where is God? Why aren't you near? What's going on in my life? Well, disobedience is a huge drug, and you've heard me say that for 4 weeks. And even God, who tried to wake Jonah up to his need to feel compassion for the lost, he sent this old salt sailor, down to the hull, down to the belly of the ship, to wake Jonah up, who was drugged, and wake him up and to say, Jonah, pray to your God. Would you pray? Would you get right with your God? And Jonah says, no, I will not. Throw me over the ship. I mean, there's this hatred. I'm trying to imagine the depth of his hatred for the Ninevites, that he wanted them destroyed so badly that he would not. And he tells the sailors, throw me over the side of the ship, throw me into the sea, and you'll be okay. But I'm not going to pray. Do you get the hardness of his heart? I mean, imagine being confronted with somebody very directly about what's wrong in your life and then hardening yourself to it, you know, and resisting it. And actually what happens is that your life becomes a complete reflection of what you rejected. And you spend all your days running from the reality of your problem. And so God, of course, loved Jonah, and he wasn't going to let him get away. And so God had him thrown into the water. He went down into the depths of the sea. Don't forget to go look at those pictures. The one that won is powerful. It shows Jonah coming down, and where's the great fish sitting? At the very bottom of the ocean. Cool fish. And he goes down, he's swallowed by this fish, and in the belly of the fish in chapter 2, he finally comes to God. It's fascinating that, you know, you don't have to go anywhere to come to God. Wherever you are, whatever's going on in your life, God is there waiting for you. He's like the father of the prodigal son, standing there in your life, looking with this age-old question, woman, man, where are you? Waiting for you to turn and say, here I am, God. And you can come to God from wherever you are, no matter what's going on in your life. And so Jonah turns to God, and he repents, he prays. And God, in chapter 3, gives him a second chance, recommissions him, give him the thing that's going to bring meaning and purpose and significance to his life. But Jonah can't let go of the hatred still. Oh, he'll go and do it. Oh, I'll do what you want me to do, God, but I'm not going to like it, right? And so Jonah, he gets up, he listens to God, says, go to Nineveh, give him the message I told you to give him. And Jonah goes, he walks through Nineveh, and he preaches the worst sermon I've ever heard. I preach better than Jonah. Of course, I don't have near the results that Jonah had. 120,000 people in one day. I mean, that's pretty cool. But he preached this 5 Hebrew words, 5 words. It says, in 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed. That's the whole message. And then he turns around and watches. And what we're going to see today, after he preaches the message, we, of course, read about their repentance. Jonah, I don't think, is conscious of their repentance yet. Because in chapter 4, we see him go, move up to a hill to sit on the city to watch, to see what God's going to do. But we know in the story that the king calls for a fast. He begs, he dust clothes himself. He gets out of his royal garments, and he lays before God, and he begs for God's forgiveness. Jonah goes and delivers his message for 3 days, this great sermon. He doesn't even tell him the whole message. And he knows the whole message, as we're going to see, but he doesn't tell it to him. And so he goes out, and what happens is he sees that God is going to forgive them. He hears that God is going to forgive him, and that his word, in 40 days, Nineveh will be destroyed. It's not going to happen. And this is what happens. Now, this chapter 4 reveals itself in 2 acts. Act 1, Jonah's discussion with God. And Jonah thinks that the whole message, this whole story is about him. Actually, the book is named, who's the head character? He thinks it's about him. Of course, it's all about Jonah, right? It's all about you and me, right? Our life and the things that happen to our life are all about us, right? Yeah. I told you I got a wonderful birthday card. I've been trying to recharge the battery so I can share it with you. I love it. And it says this: I wish I could have overheard the response in heaven when God came up with his one-of-a-kind creation, you. See, it's all about me. The people, I won't tell you who gave me that, but their names are Gwen and Claire. I play dominoes with them, and they know that when we play dominoes, it's all about me. Man, I'm very competitive. I go after it, and they thought that was a very good card. Well, Jonah was wrapped up in this whole idea that everything that was going on was all about him. And he made these 4 major blunders when he interpreted the life around him as being in the center of it, and that everything mattered, all that mattered was him. These are the things that he had to learn. Number 1, he thought that it was my agenda that mattered. And so verse 1a, it says this change of plans, God's change of plans to redeem Nineveh, the change of plans greatly upset Jonah, and he became very angry. You can't express the depth of this. The Hebrew text is so powerful. In English, we have singular and plural in verbs, in Hebrew, they have singular, plural, dual, and intensive. Intensive means that it increases the quality, not the quantity. And the literal rendering of this phrase in Hebrew is, when God forgave Nineveh, it was badness to Jonah with great badness. Badness with great badness. It was bad, 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 bad. He hated them so much. The thought of him having to relate to them as part of his life, the thought of having to walk in equal standing with them was overwhelming to Jonah. He couldn't accept that. He hated them so much. You see, it was about his agenda. Don't mess up my agenda, God. And my agenda was judgment. God, I want them judged because, number 2, I have my rights. We read in verse 2. So he complained to the Lord. Now, I don't have any idea what that would be like, because I don't think I've ever complained to the Lord. Have you? Look out. He complained to the Lord about it. Didn't I told you so. Didn't I tell you that's why I didn't want to go? You see, do you get his confession here? Jonah was running not so much because he was afraid of the Ninevites, although he was running because he didn't want God to forgive him. He didn't want God to bless them and restore them to a healthy, happy relationship. He was running because he didn't want them to get the message of God's grace and God's love and God's compassion. He wanted them judged. And he couldn't bear the thought of living with them in some sort of peace after all that they've done. He couldn't handle it. And so he runs from them. He runs from it, and he said, God, I just can't stand it. It's great badness that you would forgive them in any way. And point number 3, it violated his sense of justice. See, he had a sense of justice. You see, they did this. This is the way they live. These rotten, violent people, they deserve your judgment, God, and I want you to judge them. I don't want them to be forgiven. They deserve it. They got just what they deserve. Of course, you and I have never felt that way about anybody's problems that we've seen. None of us has ever seen anyone and said, well, if they'd have made better decisions otherwise, they wouldn't be in this mess. No one of us has ever said that. I tell you, I hate sometimes a religious right that comes on TV and says that Haiti is suffering because their ancestors 300 years ago made a pact with the devil. I just hate that. I hate that because that presents the view. I mean, do they not? Don't they read the Bible? I mean, my goodness, the book of Job is so clear. Jesus, when he saw the 21 people who were killed when the Tower of Siloam fell on them, his apostles said, hey, God, Jesus, who sinned, them or their parents, that this happened? And Jesus says, don't be stupid. That's in the Greek. He said, don't be stupid. You know, the suffering and pain isn't necessarily because of people's sin in their life. And don't you point your finger and say so. The suffering in life of people is sometimes meant for God's glory to shine forth in the end. Sometimes suffering life, there are a plethora of reasons why God allows suffering in our life. And in Job, we're going to review all of those. But God allows suffering into our life sometimes for totally unexplainable reasons. As we study the book of Job starting next week, I want to make sure that the women know that Jennifer will be teaching that Bible study. As you saw the little clip of her today, she's got some great insights to that, and you got a great time. I'm going to take just 7 weeks. She's going to go through it for quite a while. She's going to get a lot more deep than I was in it. But she's captured the whole essence of the book in her statement that says, it's all about, will you trust God when things are hard? Will you? That's what the contest is all about. Will you trust God when your sense of justice is completely violated in your life? When things come into your life that you can't rationalize? Or is your understanding, is your reason more important than your trust and your faith and your confidence? Do you have to understand everything before you can continue to trust God? His sense of justice was violated, and he couldn't handle it. Also, his pride, number 4, his pride. Just kill me now, Lord. Oh, wait a minute. I didn't read number 3, verse 2c. Oh, this is important. I told you that Job only gave Nineveh half the message. You know, his 5 words to the Ninevites were, in 40 days, God is going to destroy the city. That's pretty much what he said. But look at what else he knew that he didn't tell them. I knew that you, God, are a merciful and compassionate God, slow to get angry and filled with unfailing love. You are eager to turn back from destroying people. Why didn't he say that to the Ninevites? Why didn't he say, you know, you have been pretty wicked people and God's judgment is going to fall on you. However, if you confess your sin and repent, God will forgive you, and you and I will become close and loving. Oh, no. He wanted God's grace and mercy and understanding to him, but he couldn't allow it to be given to others, especially those that hurt him, especially those that didn't deserve it. He couldn't let that go. His sense of justice was so violated. And so he really only spoke to them half the message, but God is in his great sovereignty, he moved them, and for some reason, they grasped their knowledge of the one true God, and that king says, perhaps even now, if we repent and confess, God will forgive us, and he'll restore our lives, and he'll be merciful to us. And guess what? He was. Somehow they knew that this God was that way. This God was gracious and kind and loving. And he moved him. They moved him, and they repented, and he forgave them. But Job's retribution theology held strong. He couldn't let go of it. Some of you heard the testimonies last week of the people, and several of them were pretty powerful. One of them said specifically about how he knows people that don't like him and he don't like very well. And it's not that he wants those people to go to hell, remember? But he don't really care if they go to heaven. Remember that? Now, I have a lot of people that don't like me very much. I ask for raising of hands here, so I take names. Thank you, 1, 2. All right, that's enough. I'm just kidding. And some people that I don't like very much and don't like me. And the truth is, I don't want anybody to go to hell. But I sure don't care if they go to heaven, you know? Do you know what I mean? There's no compassion. There's no intimate identity with the ultimate welfare of other people, especially those I don't like or don't like me, right? And this is what Jonah was like. And his pride, number 4 was his pride or his appearance. Listen to what he says. Just kill me now, Lord. I love that. Just kill me now. Come on. Kill me now, Lord. I'd rather be dead than alive if what I predicted will not happen. I don't want to be embarrassed. You make a liar out of me. I mean, I preached to this whole city that 40 days are going to be destroyed, and now you're not going to destroy them. What does that make me look like, God? This guy, his pride, his agenda, I mean, his rights, I mean, his sense of justice and his pride was more valuable to him than the souls of human beings. It was more important to him to be right than to see the nation of pagans converted and saved. And God needed to teach him that. Now, remember I mentioned to you that this story of Jonah is a parable to Israel so they would grasp their failure. Because Israel was called to be a light to the world and to share God's grace with other people around them. And they failed to do that. And the story was written so that Israel would see themselves in the story. Jesus himself, when he told the story of the prodigal son, remember that story? That was told to the religious leaders listening so that they would understand that who they identify with? The older brother. You see, because the prodigal son, he got just what he deserved. He took all the blessings that God has given him, all the wealth that he inherited with his father, and he ran off to the big city and he wasted it and he spent it and he threw it out. And he did all that, and he ended up a slave in a pigsty. And then he comes home and wants forgiveness. He comes back home to the Father, and he's wearing, have you ever seen Rembrandt's painting of the prodigal? Oh, it's powerful. The prodigal son is in sackcloth. His head is shaved. He's bald, and you see marks on his skull because he had become a slave, and that was the mark of a slave, the bald head. He had, his clothes were torn. He has one sandal that's worn off and another sandal that's missing. He's laying there and he's on his knees before his father, hugging his father, and on the context that he's begging for forgiveness. And his brother, who, by the way, is a self-portrait of Rembrandt. Rembrandt painted himself as the older brother, standing back with his arm folded, looking at the scene. And you can feel, there's no movement, but you can feel the disdain. No passion. And Jonah sees the grief. He sees the repentance, and there's no compassion. He doesn't care about them. Just as the older brother doesn't care about the son, there's no compassion. It's fascinating. God now turns to give him a children's story. He gives us a living parable. I love the way Jesus and the way God, and they give us stories that have great pictures in them, because he uses those to bring us to our senses. And now he moves to talk about what really matters, and in the Lord's response, we hear this in verse 4. The Lord replied, Jonah, and Jonah is still like this. Is it right for you to be angry because these people are going to be saved? Do you know what that is? It right for you? Where are your values? I mean, what really matters to you, Jonah? What is really important to you? He tries to get Jonah to take a look at his priorities in life. And so he goes on to teach Jonah what it's really all about. And in verse 5 we read, Then Jonah went to the east side of the city and made a shelter to sit under as he waited to see what would happen to the city. He still is looking for God's judgment to fall. He's still expecting something to happen. And of course, he has to get out of the city because he knows what's going to happen in 40 days. It's going to destroy. So he couldn't stay in the Super 8, the Nineveh Super 8 or the Motel 6, because if he was there, he would be destroyed as well. He had to get out of the city. So he goes out of the city and he gets comfortable. He makes himself a shelter to protect him from the sun. Because if you'd have spent 3 days in the belly of the well, all the pigmentation would have been sucked out of your body and you'd have been white, and sun would kill you. Wouldn't it? Sun would burn you so bad. And so sun was a heavy danger to Jonah. So he goes out and he builds him a shelter. He sits under this and he waits to see what happened. I can't wait. Start the show, God. Thunder, lightning, judgment. I know. But God now tells him brings him through experiences which teaches him that what really matters are these four things: God's grace, his undeserved favor. Isn't it interesting that even in spite of Jonah, Jonah is standing here like this, and God is still gracious to Jonah? That's remarkable. When the prodigal son's brother stands and looks over his younger brother and can't have any compassion on him, his father speaks to him gracious words and encourages him to change. Don't you know, he says, that your son was lost and now he's found. Your brother was lost and now he's found. Your brother was dead and now he's alive. All we can do is celebrate. But the older brother's sense of justice was violated. His rights were violated. Father, you've never thrown a party for me. That's called sulking. I had my grandsons Friday night. We had a lot of fun. Playing baseball with them in the basement. I have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old. And we play wiffle ball, and they swing, and they're really good. 3-year-old is surprisingly good. Takes after his grandpa. Anyway, he throw the ball, and he hits it. Cool, get it, throw the ball. He hits it again. Good, go. Throw the ball, and he misses it. So I say, okay, now is TJ's turn. That TJ, the 7-year-old, I'm going to throw one to him. No, it's mine. It's mine. I have an agenda. No. And he sticks out that. And all of a sudden, I wasn't very pleasant to him. Zeke, no pouting. No sulking. Go sit in the corner. Of course, he runs to Grandma, and Grandma holds him and loves him and comforts him, and no wonder the kids are so spoiled and rotten. No. But God, in his grace to us when we sulk, he still is gracious to us, and he still tries to move us back into his will. His undeserved favor. And the Lord God arranged. Now, you got to understand this arranged, that sometimes it's had prepared, and some of the translations say he had prepared for him a leafy plant to grow there, and soon it spread its broad leaves over Jonah's head, shading him from the sun. This eased his discomfort, and Jonah was very grateful for the plant. Now, remember how it was bad with all badness? This is grateful with all gratefulness. It's the ultimate intensity of greatness. He really loved this plant. He and this plant would get along fine. That plant provided something that he really needed. It gave him shade. Some of the translations say it's a gourd. You ever heard of the gourd? And if you see pictures of it, you see it as a huge over his head with fruit hanging from it. It provided him with moisture, with nourishment. Of course, he had something he had to live on for 40 days, and God gave him this plant out there, and he really loved this plant. He became really attached to the plant. This eased his discomfort, and Job was very grateful. And his comfort, he was self-satisfied. He was sitting in his home in Blair, Nebraska, in Nineveh, with his big screen TV, with his gourd, with plenty of food with his plant, just self-satisfied, unconcerned, not at all caring about what might happen to the people in the city. Uncompassionate. And he didn't see God's sovereign hand in his life, number 2. God's sovereignty in my life is what matters. But God also arranged, and here's an interesting, by the way, if you study the book of Jonah, you might do a study on he prepared or he arranged, because he arranged the east wind that brought the storm. He arranged the whale, the great fish that swallowed him. He arranged for the ship to throw him up, the well to throw him up. He arranged for the plant. He arranged for, and that's the verse 7, he arranged for a worm. It took a lot of work, to arrange for the worm. You notice the interesting thing about Jonah is it spans almost all biological life in one way or another. It's really interesting. That would be another interesting study of Jonah. And he prepared a worm, and the next morning at dawn, the worm ate through the stem of the plant so that it withered away. You see, God wasn't going to allow Jonah to remain comfortable with his big screen TV, his gourd. He wasn't going to allow Jonah to remain comfortable with his shelter and his house and his comfort. He sent a worm that, like the canker, that ate away at the joy in his disobedience, in his failure to love and to feel the hurt of other people. And as he resisted that, God made that life bitter. That worm ate the very juices out of what mattered to him, and it just ruined his life. And eventually the worm ate and it destroyed that plant. God was not going to let Jonah live a life without learning the need to be compassionate on other people. But Jonah did not put all this preparation stuff together. And he did not see the sovereignty of God working in all of his life. He not only did not see that God's sovereignty over his life was important, but number 3, God's sovereignty over all life was what really mattered. You see, God not only loves me, he loves you. That's hard to believe. He not only loves me, he loves the one who I don't love and who doesn't love you. God is sovereign over all life. And so verses 8 and 9, it says, and the sun grew hot. This was not good for Jonah. God arranged, God's sovereignty is working again, for a scorching east wind to blow on Jonah. This was not good for Jonah. I would argue that all the hair of his body had been digested. The sun beat down on his head until he grew faint and he wished to die. Death is certainly better than living like this. Boy, I'm glad I'm not. I've never said that. Then God said to Jonah, check your values one more time. Is it right? Is it right for you to be angry because the plant died? Jonah hardened his heart to this confrontation. I mean, there was this presentation of truth into his heart, and he says, no, I'm right even to my death. I will not change, God. Do you imagine what the Israelite religious leaders would have thought when Jesus told the story of Jonah and pointed it at them? There's an interesting connection with the timing, by the way, but I'm not going to go through it. I mean, the point of it is that they were confronted with the reality of their life and their pride and their agenda, their business. They couldn't hear it. They wouldn't hear it. He said, I'd rather die than go ahead and change my schedule, my agenda, my purpose, and my feelings towards these people. Boy, is there anyone in your life that you are so hardened to that you won't and can't change towards that person, towards those people? You see, what really matters in God's sovereignty is point number 4, God's love for all people. For the people in Haiti, for the people in the DR, for the people in Guatemala, for the people all over the world, for the people that you hate, for the people that hate you, for you. What matters to God is other people. Then the Lord said, you feel sorry about the plant, though you did nothing to put it there. It came quickly and died quickly, but Nineveh has more than 120,000 people living in spiritual darkness, one translation says. They don't know their right hand from their left. They're living these terrible, painful lives of not knowing God. And you think that these people in Nineveh are happy and successful and pleasing? You think that they're living meaningful lives? And you don't care a thing about them? They're living in spiritual darkness. And then he uses, not to mention all the animals. Isn't it interesting? All the plant life, animal life, the worms that is mentioned in this. Why has God cared about the animals? I would argue that he's not that concerned about the animals. What he's concerned about is his priorities. You see, Jonah is more concerned about a plant, this lower order of life. He's more concerned about a big screen, a gourd, than he is an animal, which is a higher order of life, or human beings, which are the highest order of life. You see, he's more concerned about that. His comfort means more to him than the suffering of all the people around him. And he's hardened his heart. And he sits comfortably in the shelter that he's made. And he withdraws himself from the feeling of the pain of those around him. And he doesn't care. And he tells God, I won't care. Although there are people all around that are miserable, that need to hear what God, just that he judges and he storms to your life. But that he's merciful and he wants no one to live. He wants everything from God. God to our own detriment. God and our disobedience. Aware of the sovereign working until God finally takes us down into the depths of the belly of the well until we cry out. Did Jonah get it? Good Jonah. That is the last one that speaks. Oh, I know. Jason said, oh, yes, God, yeah. But what was I thinking? It doesn't tell us that. Do you know why God? Because bond. He wasn't finished yet. It's God's mission to answer is for God. And the parable looks back and he applies it to the story of the prodigal son, older brother who stands there in compassion on the brother who story ends. What? We don't know how. Why don't? Because it was written end of the story there so that you'll read it and you'll apply it. What do I do? And that's why Jesus gave it, so that we could still apply. Jonah with so many cool, he gave him this great, good food, big screen TV, Super Bowl, about that than he did about and suffering. The story's not done. We go out and we're going to write the end of ourselves. And then you're going to watch a testimony. Someone else. Let's pray. Father, I just the depth of it and the breadth of it. And Lord, if we open our heart, please don't let me be like I'd rather die. Lord, harden themselves, passion for other people. Reevaluate their pride. What matters most in their life? Oh, Father, harden themselves. And Lord, many know in our world are running. They're running because by sin, by disobedience, graciously and loving whole. Who needs that today to Jesus Christ. Their story, trust, and hope. Watch this final testimony.
My name's Rebecca Bacher. I am married to Clay Bacher. If I would start, when I was maybe about 9 months old, being a mom was too, and she left me, and my dad came home in the afternoon to find my son. During that time, my father was a wonderful dad, a great part of his grieving process, so he became an atheist. My mom came back to it, decided she wanted to be part of our life. Predictable that my father felt was with her because he needed sisters that lived there, and my aunt was she had a boyfriend that was sister, and I were both molested. Nobody to turn to. Hard. I didn't. Who did I have? And then he married. I was in about 4th grade, and sent mother, and she worked very good, and I rebelled. I found God for the first time. Started running with kids because I thought they were very comical. They had and I feel like I'm a 5-year-old cynic, atheist and an agnostic, no structure. And at these friends, I started told my dad that one night, that Jesus guy, I think he has to say, good. And then, and he decided to meet him and said, it's either me. She knew my dad would pick me out for her. So everything that was happening, I made the hard, I ran, and I wanted nothing. And high school, turning to drugs. And something that I had to work on then, and that was self away. Just a black side, trying to find something to a boy or a hot, getting so think about it anymore. I just kept running for I had to change my life. And I laid there and thought to myself,